Finally, our quote of the night comes from Margaret Thatcher, who on this day in 1979 was sworn in as the first female prime minister of the United Kingdom. She once said, quote, "Any woman who understands the problems of running a home will be nearer to understanding the problems of running a country." Well said. We will be back here on Monday night at 7. Have a great weekend. Tucker Carlson coming up next.
Well, good evening and welcome to Tucker Carlson Tonight. It's hard to remember now, but Robert Mueller's special counsel investigation began as a probe into Russian collusion. You'll recall the story we were told then. A foreign power influenced the outcome of our election. We've got to figure out how exactly that happened and determine if any American citizens were involved in that plot. Well, that's how the whole thing was sold to the rest of us. And by the way, some Republicans on Capitol Hill still seem to believe that's what it's about. Nobody ever accused them of genius. But to the rest of us, it's pretty obvious what's going on. And to make it even clearer, Robert Mueller just hired a new prosecutor the other day. Once again, another Hillary donor. There doesn't seem to be a single Republican on Robert Mueller's staff. In an evenly divided country, what are the odds of that? Well, 100% actually, once you understand the purpose of this whole exercise. What you're looking at is a political campaign waged with guns and subpoenas and the surveillance power of the U.S. government. In conventional politics, the kind we used to have, Republican candidates, Democratic candidates run against each other. One wins, one loses, sometimes someone retires. That's how we used to conduct it. Now, lives are being destroyed forever. People are going bankrupt. Others are heading to prison. Well, today, a federal judge finally tried to slam the brakes on all of this. District Court Judge T.S. Ellis erupted in a way that federal judges rarely do. He accused Mueller and his team of granting themselves, quote, unfettered power to wage politics rather than a legitimate criminal investigation. Quote, you don't really care about Paul Manafort's bank fraud, the judge said. You really care about what information Mr. Manafort can give you to lead to Mr. Trump and an impeachment or whatever. It was a shocking moment precisely because what he said was entirely true. And yet somehow the Mueller investigation continues tonight, leaving lives in its wake. Mueller's latest target, according to recent news reports, is longtime Republican political consultant Roger Stone. Roger Stone joins us right now. Roger, thanks for coming on. So, according to NBC, and I want to read you a quote I know you're familiar with, you are, quote, one of the top subjects of the investigation into potential collusion between Moscow and the Trump campaign. NBC says Robert Mueller is, quote, focusing intensely on you. What about you has triggered the scrutiny of Mueller? What crime is he suggesting you committed?
Well, Tucker, perhaps it's my advocacy of the election of Donald Trump and my 40-year friendship for him and my role in advocating and working for his election. I like to call this the Russian collusion delusion. So far, he has turned up no evidence of collusion by the Russian state. I certainly am not involved in any conspiracy or coordination or collusion with the Russian state. I think this is a fairy tale, a left-wing conspiracy theory that is the basis for a rogue operation to undo the results of the last election.
But meanwhile, it's an actual active criminal investigation. And according to NBC, the CNBC story, Mueller is looking at you because of your longtime friendship, it suggests, with Rick Gates, who was the associate of Paul Manafort, who was indicted and pled to a number of felonies. It said he was an intern in an office that you had 30 years ago and that you had repeated contact with him. It didn't say about what. To what extent is that true?
Well, our longtime relationship, I think the first time I met him was in 2016. I don't believe he worked at Black, Manafort and Stone back in the 80s. He evidently was an intern in the successor firm after I left. The CNBC story specifically says that the special counsel is focused on our dinners with an S. I only know of one dinner attended by many the purpose of which was to discuss the apportionment of the New York delegates to the Republican National Convention to try to make sure there were a few Trump supporters on the delegation after Donald Trump swept the New York primary. They're also, according to CNBC, focusing on my meetings with Mr. Gates at Trump Tower, at which there were absolutely none. This whole thing is based on conjecture, speculation, supposition, but no facts. My contacts with Rick Gates during the campaign were minimal and innocuous. I hate to say this, but I think the source for this CNBC story, I think they got bullshifted, as some Republicans now say.
Well, speaking of Congressman Adam Schiff, the ranking member of the House Intelligence Committee, he said before the Congress, and his remarks were echoed by Hillary Clinton, that you knew ahead of time that Hillary campaign chairman John Podesta's Gmail account had been hacked by the Russians and its contents were going to become public. Did you know that? How did you know that, if so? And why would he say that?
That is categorically false. It's a shame that Congressman Schiff is allowed to hide behind his congressional immunity. Even the final report of the House Intelligence Committee truncates and incorrectly quotes my now iconic tweet. I said, the Podestas, referring to both John and Tony's, time in the barrel will come, referring to entirely public information published in the Panama Papers early in 2016 that exposed their shady business dealings in Russia. Context: Paul Manafort's business dealings in the Ukraine were being fed to the media at the time. I thought it only fair that the facts regarding the Podestas come forward. Nowhere did I say that his email would be hacked. I had no advanced knowledge of that hack. Just while we're on it, to be clear, I never received any material from WikiLeaks or Assange. I never passed anything on to Donald Trump, and I never had any contact with the Russian state and received nothing from them, including allegedly hacked emails. As I said earlier, this is a left-wing conspiracy theory promulgated by people like Robbie Mook and others, Adam Schiff, surfer boy Eric Swalwell. They hide behind their congressional immunity and they run a campaign of smear, innuendo, and personal attack.
But this isn't just a public relations campaign waged by members of Congress against Republicans. There's a criminal component to it. So news reports have said that you were the subject of a FISA warrant. In other words, the federal government was reading your email, tapping your phone, following you around, whatever, was surveilling you using our intel and law enforcement agencies. Do you believe that's true?
Well, the New York Times reported on January 20th of 2017 that I was the subject of a FISA warrant. What their probable cause would be is hard to understand other than my strong support for Donald Trump. I wish this were just a public relations value. I have the Project for Democracy, an Obama-blessed front, suing me in the District of Columbia. What's their claim? Oh, that I worked with the Russians to hack the DNC email and gave the information to WikiLeaks. They don't produce any evidence or proof. They produce a theory. Now, the Democratic National Committee has filed a virtually mirror lawsuit in the courts in New York. It costs hundreds of thousands of dollars just to move to dismiss these suits. I'm facing the prospect of
what does this investigation cost you?
Well, between the House Intelligence Committee, the Project Democracy or Project for Democracy lawsuit, the early rumblings of the Senate Intelligence and Judiciary Committee, a lawsuit in Miami from a Chinaman named Miles Kwok, which is a total quack of Schiff, and the prospect now of a probe by Mr. Mueller into non-existent communications and machinations with Mr. Gates. I could be looking at legal fees of up to $1 million. Anybody who wants to help can go to stonedefensefund.com. I have no choice to go on InfoWars, where I do a daily show, to come here and to beg for money to protect the solvency and the college education of my grandchildren.
You better be a Russian agent. I mean it. I hope you're a Russian agent. Otherwise, this really is a miscarriage and an assault on the civil liberties of all of us. And I wish the left agreed with me on that. Roger Stone, thank you.
Tucker, thanks for having me.
Tom Dupree is a former Deputy Assistant Attorney General, and he joins us tonight. Tom, thanks a lot for coming on. I wanted to talk to you because I think you have perspective on this. So we saw a federal judge today basically attack the Mueller investigation, accuse it of giving itself unfettered power, and accuse it of political motivations. Have you ever seen anything like that from a federal judge?
You know, Tucker, I can't think of a time I've seen something like this happen. I mean, this is really extraordinary. Judge Ellis really dropped a little bit of a bombshell in the Mueller camp this morning. He is questioning not simply the merit of the substantive charges that Mueller's brought against Manafort, but Mueller's power to begin this investigation and to conduct this prosecution at all. Now, we take everything a judge says in court from the bench with a grain of salt. I've certainly been in cases where you leave the courtroom thinking the judge is going to toss an indictment out the door, and then it turns out it stays in place. So we have to wait to see what he rules. But I got to say, the Mueller camp has to be very surprised and disturbed by what unfolded this morning.
So what is the recourse for the ancillary figures caught up in this investigation? So we just talked to Roger Stone, obviously a colorful, outrageous character, probably, you know, done a lot of things people disagree with. But the charge is that he's colluding with the Russian government. And he's basically going bankrupt because of that charge. If it turns out in the end he hasn't colluded with the Russian government, he's out $1 million and his reputation and livelihood is destroyed. Can he do anything about that? Can any of these people do anything about it if they're innocent?
You know, Tucker, I wish I could say they have all sorts of remedies and recourses, but the answer is it is exceedingly difficult for someone who, at the end of the day, is ultimately vindicated to recover. The law just isn't set up for something like that. You typically would try to rein it in on the front end, either by hoping that prosecutors are responsible and making the choices as to whom to investigate, whom to indict, and of course you have the protection of a federal judge, as we saw this morning, making sure that these prosecutions are properly before the court.
So you have Adam Schiff of California, who's totally irresponsible and dishonest, completely dishonest, getting up and accusing an American citizen of involvement in a criminal hacking of an email account. It turns out that's false. There's nothing you can do about that? A member of Congress is protected by his office?
They have the speech and debate clause gives congressmen fairly broad protection as to what they can say and do. At the end of the day, I think a private citizen's protection from something like this often is in the ballot box rather than in a court of law. That just doing what you're doing and what we're doing here, which is to say put a spotlight on over-the-top statements that are not supported by the evidence, and hope that ultimately the American people will see that there was no merit to some of these allegations.
God, it's just all so irresponsible. It's shocking this is happening in America. Just in the 20 seconds, does this shock you? Are you surprised that this is what our system is producing?
Well, I am disappointed more than anything, Tucker. I guess what's frustrating from my perspective is that what we are seeing is just the increased attempt to criminalize what in many cases are simply policy differences. People on the other side of the aisle, an election outcome you don't like, and you say, let's prosecute.
Yeah, you don't like Trump. Okay. You know, beat him in the midterms. I mean, it's unbelievable. Tom, thank you for that perspective. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Tucker.
Dan Bongino joins us later in the show for more on Judge Ellis's critique of the Mueller investigation, which really is an amazing moment. I have no idea if the other channels are covering it. They should, because it doesn't happen very often, things like that. But first, a grocery store sued by the Trump administration, got to be honest, for telling its employees they should be speaking English. Now the government's going after him for that. Details ahead. A supermarket chain is being taken to court by the federal government because it asked a few of its employees to speak English. The federal government's Equal Opportunity Commission, EEOC, is suing an Albertsons in San Diego, saying it created a hostile work environment by pressuring employees not to converse in Spanish. According to the EEOC, requiring English is a form of de facto discrimination based on national origin, an insane interpretation, but the EEOC says it cannot be tolerated, and so it won't be. Ethan Behrman is a California radio host, and he joins us tonight. So, Ethan, thanks for coming on. Obviously, the language that you speak is not the same as the country you are from. Plenty of American-born employees speak foreign languages. So it's not the same as discriminating on the basis of national origin. Why can't a business say, this is our building, and here are the standards of behavior that we expect our employees to meet? I thought that's kind of fundamental to employment, isn't it?
Well, if you're interacting with a customer, you can require for the operation of the business to require English, for example. But in this case, these were people who were talking not with customers, but amongst themselves. So that seems really over the top. And yes, it becomes discriminatory, because why else would a manager say you can't speak Spanish here? Why not say, hey, you can't speak any language other than English? But remember, English is not an official language of the United States, Tucker. We're
well,
not
I know,
at
and
that place where we say
one of
you can only speak English here.
That's one of our core weaknesses, that it's not the official language. But again, doesn't an employer have a right to say you have to wear certain clothing, you have to dress and behave in a certain way? Language is not an inherent characteristic, and it's not a racial category. And so why shouldn't an employer have the right to ask that of its employees?
Well, again, if I'm not interacting, they do have that right, again, if it affects directly how the business is able to operate. But if I'm stocking shelves, if you and I are back in the back room stocking shelves, and I want to start speaking Swedish with you or something, what does that have to do with how the business is functioning?
I don't know.
Operating?
I mean,
why should
isn't that
it doesn't?
But isn't that a well, I don't know. Maybe it is. I mean, that's a decision that should be up to the people who own and run the business, not some moron bureaucrat back in Washington, right?
No, I actually totally disagree with you on this one, Tucker. And here's why. It was the Soviets that had to Russify the countries that they dominated. It's the Chinese that say, all of you outer region have to speak Mandarin. You can't speak your native languages anymore. We don't want to be like the Chinese or the Soviets and start forcing people to start speaking a different language.
Which I'm from, is not an outer region. It's part of the continental United States. We didn't conquer it. It's a state. It's not a province or a territory or an occupied nation seeking freedom. It's part of the United States. And by the way, look, you know what this really is, which is the left seeks to divide the country along racial and ethnic and cultural lines. It's their full-time job. Let me ask you a simple question. Is there a single country in the world you know of that's bilingual or multilingual that's not at war with itself?
Well, I don't believe Brazil is at war with itself, other than their presidents continue to commit crimes and get arrested there. But Brazil doesn't commit war with itself, and there are many languages spoken there. We have a lot of examples around the world that are
Brazil is a deeply
and
divided country. Look, there's no country that I'm aware of on Earth where you don't have an overwhelming majority of people united in a language, except those countries like Belgium, like Canada, that are riven by these cultural and linguistic differences. Like, language is culture. Why wouldn't you want your whole country to speak one language? Why is that bad? Isn't that the goal?
Well, of course, and ultimately, you know, in government interactions, in our international business transactions, and again, back to the EEOC in this story, a business, when it is relevant to the function of the business and required for them to operate, they can require somebody to speak English. But this is intruding on two individual employees communicating amongst themselves.
Right, okay, yeah. But says who? I mean, do you really think that the EEOC, and I'm sad to say it's a Trump administration office, but the EEOC back in Washington knows more about how to run a supermarket than the guys who run Albertsons in San Diego?
Well, I would suggest that we have one manager in particular that is being singled out by the EEOC for doing these actions and pointing it out. Yeah, I think that there are times that we have to call out people for doing things that we know are overtly wrong and targeting very specific minority groups. That is our responsibility.
But first of all, okay, I would say Spanish speakers are hardly a minority in California. That's just not true. I mean, if they are, it's only by a little bit. It's like half the state practically speaks, literally, I think it's 45% speaks Spanish at home, so it's not a minority, really. But I just got to ask you, why wouldn't liberals who believe or say they do in bringing people together encourage every American to speak English everywhere? Language brings us together. Isn't that obvious?
Because, but our language is more than just where we live right now. It is our heritage as well. You know, if I go to the synagogue, we speak Hebrew there. Should I be stopped from that because I need to speak English everywhere? Can my friends who come over from Germany, you know, can they speak German as well? I mean, I don't agree with that. I think that there are times and places for speaking English.
Okay, but look, that is a ludicrous example. I don't think in the congregation in most synagogues people are speaking Hebrew, and if there are, more power to them. But that is a tiny slice of our public life. I just mean day to day in the functions of government. Why wouldn't you want as many people as possible to be speaking the same language. You're dividing them if you're not encouraging them to do that, aren't you?
I think we do want people to speak as much the same language, but again, in this case, we had individual employees, when they weren't interacting with customers, speaking a language amongst themselves that they were comfortable with. I worked at McDonald's as a teenager and spoke another language to a coworker of mine because it was fun to do that so people couldn't eavesdrop, even though we were taking care of the customers in English. You know, intruding on that aspect of individual personal lives and interactions, I think would be government overreach. And in this case, though, we have a manager trying to intrude on somebody's ability to speak a language with one another.
It's a private business, and working for one means giving up, you know, some of your freedom of expression. But Ethan, thank you. Great to see you.
Thanks, Tucker.
The U.S. appears to be moving ever closer to some kind of conflict with Iran. Is that good for America? Will it make us stronger or richer or happier? Congresswoman Tulsi Gabbard at the center of that debate next. After some unconventional, really unprecedented diplomatic moves, the Trump administration looks like it could be about to achieve long-term peace with North Korea, which is amazing and unexpected. In the Middle East, though, the administration appears to be moving toward a possible showdown with Iran. Is this wise? And could, in fact, feuding with Iran imperil negotiations on the Korean Peninsula? Here's what Congresswoman Tulsi Gabbard of Hawaii had to say about it. We talked to her a minute ago. Congresswoman Tulsi Gabbard is a Democrat representing the state of Hawaii, and she joins us now. Congresswoman, thanks for coming on. You've been, I would say, nonpartisan in your assessment of foreign policy issues. You're for some, you're against others connected to the administration based on whether you agree with them. So given that, what's your view of what's unfolding in North Korea?
Well, Tucker, this is actually a really historic opportunity that we see unfolding before us right now. Important to the people of my home state of Hawaii, the people of this country, and to the world, where we have an opportunity to make an agreement that will denuclearize North Korea and help move us closer towards peace. You know, whatever people feel about Donald Trump, whether they like him or they don't like him, this is the time for people to rise above the partisan politics, recognize this is not about Donald Trump. This is about peace for the American people and for the world, and the opportunity to make an agreement that will finally end the Korean War and bring about the denuclearization of North Korea. If we fail to do this, if President Trump is not successful in this, the consequences would be dire for the people of this country and to the world.
So Congress has an oversight role here. Presidents don't get to conduct foreign policy solely by themselves. Congress needs to be informed. Are you confident that you're getting enough information, not just about North Korea, but about what is happening in Syria, for example, or our posture toward Iran? Are you getting the information you need to make informed decisions about it?
Yes and no, but I think in each of these cases, it's important for us to recognize what is our objective and how does it best serve the American people. This is why I've been calling for quite some time now for direct negotiations between President Trump and Kim Jong-un, recognizing that it's critical for us to engage with our adversaries and talk to them, not just our friends, so that we may achieve peace and avoid more war. There are three things that need to happen in order for Trump to be successful in these negotiations that will be coming up in the coming weeks. First of all, it's important for North Korea to have credibility, or for President Trump to have credibility with North Korea in making sure that if North Korea makes this agreement with the United States, gets rid of their nuclear weapons program, that the United States is not going to go in and launch an attack and topple the North Korean regime. This is the reason why they've had their nuclear weapons program as a deterrent to regime change. A few things need to happen in order for that credibility to exist. Number one is we need to end the regime change war that we've been waging in Syria since 2011, both directly and indirectly, and end our policy of going around and acting as the policemen of the world, toppling dictators that we don't like. Number two, President Trump and his administration, they need to publicly acknowledge that Bush's overthrow of Saddam Hussein was a huge mistake. They need to publicly acknowledge that President Obama and Hillary Clinton's toppling of Gaddafi in Libya was a huge mistake. In that situation with Libya, we need to recognize publicly, Trump needs to recognize publicly that this agreement was made with Gaddafi to get rid of his nuclear weapons program in exchange for the United States is not going to come in and attack you. Now, a few years later, that's exactly what happened. We went and dropped bombs in Libya, and Gaddafi was toppled. And lastly, but perhaps maybe even most importantly, with this Iran nuclear deal that we're facing right now with President Trump threatening to drop out of it, an agreement was made between the United States and Iran and other countries to end Iran's nuclear weapons program. So far, Iran has shown to be in technical compliance with this deal. For Trump to just say, hey, we're going to throw this deal in the trash, threatens the ability for North Korea, for us to make this deal with North Korea to say, hey, how can we trust that the United States will uphold their end of the deal when we've seen time and again that they have broken their promises?
Interesting. On the campaign trail, the now president very often denounced the war in Iraq and in Libya, but not as much since becoming president. Congressman, thank you very much for coming on. It's interesting. Those are connected.
Thanks, Tucker.
I appreciate it. Well, we recently talked to author Nassim Taleb, who's got a new book out. During the interview, he explained why the people who run our government seem so eager to start fights in distant countries, because they are risking nothing personally by doing so. Here's part of the conversation.
Never in history of mankind have we had people who were warmongers without being in battle.
Yes.
This is the first phase in history you see that.
That's interesting. So how would you reconnect risk to reward?
Well, decentralization is one issue, one obvious solution. In Switzerland, decision makers in Washington look at an Excel spreadsheet, and they're not penalized by those they're punishing.
That man is really smart, and you can see the whole interview on our Facebook. Go after the show and search for our page, Tucker Carlson Tonight. It's worth it. Up next, selfies are annoying, but are they a diagnosable illness? We'll speak to a doctor who studies the subject next. Well, online and on campus, free speech is imperiled in the name of tolerance. A majority of college students now say that protecting diversity is more important than free speech, as if they're mutually exclusive. On Twitter, YouTube, and Facebook, of course, accounts are routinely banned and opinions suppressed in the name of fighting hate, which is never precisely defined, but you know what they mean. The movement comes mostly from the left, but many traditional, some of them anyway, traditional liberals are upset about it. Nadine Strossen is a former president of the ACLU, and she just released a brand new book called Hate, Why We Should Resist It with Free Speech, Not Censorship. Nadine Strossen joins us tonight. Nadine, thanks for coming on.
My pleasure.
First, a confession, you're the kind of liberal I used to make fun of. And now I wish there are more people like you. On the left, there seem to be very few. Why the change? Why are you one of the only people on the left saying, wait, hold on, free speech is more important than anything else?
Well, I'm not going to demonize the left, Tucker, because I completely agree with the sentiment expressed by former journalist, I mean, sadly he died several years ago, Nat Hentoff, whose book title said it all. Freedom of speech for me, but not for thee. How the left and right relentlessly censor each other. So a pause on
Nat Hentoff, hold on. Nat Hentoff was a wonderful man. And yes. I wouldn't say toward the end of his life he was much of a liberal. He was a pro-life activist.
Well, so, all of us
if that's the liberal you're citing, I'm okay with it.
Some of us are defending individual liberties, and that's the most important value, right?
Amen.
And
I agree.
One of the important messages of my book is that all of us, regardless of where we fall on the political spectrum, have a crucial stake in defending the same robust freedom of speech that the U.S. Supreme Court, interestingly, despite its ideological diversity, unanimously supports. In the Supreme Court's most recent decision on so-called hate speech last summer, yes. All of the justices struck down a federal statute that prohibited the use of so-called disparaging or demeaning terms as subject to trademark protection. So they upheld the right, interestingly enough, of an Asian American rock band to choose the name The Slants. Of course that's a disparaging term, but the Simon Tam and the other Asian American rock rock band members chose that not to denigrate their own ethnic origin, but for exactly the opposite reason, to celebrate their dignity and to empower themselves and show their pride. And that illustrates, Tucker, the problem with handing over to government the power to pick and choose which particular words are going to be ruled out of bounds. You have to look at the context. Right. You have to take, all of us have different subjective perceptions, and we have to make these decisions for ourselves and not turn them over to the government.
Well, I agree completely. And the reason that right really is enshrined in modern law is because the ACLU in the Brandenburg case in 1967 and a bunch of other free speech cases that the ACLU, which you ran for years, brought to the High Court. But the main threats to speech now exist not from government, but from big technology companies, particularly from Google and Facebook and Twitter. They're the conduit through which all information flows. They control speech, and they're squelching it, and the ACLU is saying nothing, and I don't know why.
Well, let me tell you, there is a big legal problem here in terms of remedies for what clearly are restrictions on speech. And by the way, I disagree with you that the ACLU has not spoken up. But first, most people do not understand that the First Amendment free speech guarantee only applies to government, to the public sector. So you have no First Amendment rights with respect to Facebook and the other private tech companies.
Yes,
however,
but hold on.
You can bring pressure on them. And Tucker, the ACLU, along with a large coalition of other civil rights and civil liberties organizations, have been complaining to Facebook for years about how they are wielding their power to take down hate speech. We've complained that they have not done it in a way that is supportive of equal rights and civil rights.
I respectfully disagree with you. I think if, the ACLU has stood back. No, it's spending all its time defending illegal aliens, whereas everybody in the world is seeing his or her free speech
Let me tell you that some of us can defend all fundamental freedoms for all people.
But the emphasis on speech has been absent at the ACLU,
well,
and I think it's really sad.
Tell that to the people who are criticizing the ACLU and lobbying us to change our position, which we have not, because we defended the free speech rights of the alt-right demonstrators in Charlottesville. That is a decision that I stand by and that my ACLU colleagues stand by, in part.
No, that's not true. Your ACLU colleagues do not stand by. Look, I'm here to tell you how much I respect your views, but you're not being honest there.
Yes,
there was a mutiny in the ACLU there, and a lot of the employees said we're not doing this anymore.
There is debate and discussion within the ACLU, Tucker. But you know what? We have not seen what we saw during the Skokie case in the late 1970s that raised exactly the same issue when the ACLU came to the defense of a group of neo-Nazis to demonstrate in a town with a large number of Holocaust survivors and other Jews.
No, I remember.
We then lost 15% of our members nationwide, and that has not happened now. Of course, there are people that are arguing that we should not continue to take those cases, but the leadership has not diverted from that. In part for this reason.
I'm torn because.
Tucker,
okay, we're almost out of time.
Yes, you yourself said that we don't have to choose between diversity and equality on the one hand and free speech on the other hand. And I couldn't agree with you more. These are mutually reinforcing, and all of us who care about racial justice and other equality causes have the biggest stake in defending robust freedom.
You filibustered me, and I've let you do it because I think you're an important voice for free speech. No, I do think that. But I think you're wrong on some of those details, but we're going to have to talk about it.
Have me back.
In some other forum. Okay, thank you, Nadine.
Thank you.
With smartphones everywhere, in every pocket, is it possible to escape selfies? Everybody gets roped in, it turns out. What does it mean for the rest of us? The president does it, Pope Francis does it. Well, now some researchers are calling this a disease, selfititis. A few people report being helplessly addicted to taking photos of themselves, so they snap hundreds of selfies every single day and are simply unable to stop. Is there more disgusting illnesses in the world? Probably not. Nell Daly is a psychotherapist, and she joins us tonight. Nell, I mean, I think it degrades science a little bit to call this an illness when it's really just self-involvement of a kind that we're familiar with, but it's reached a greater magnitude.
You know, I know that that's the gut reaction, and I can see why you would say that, but I think that there's a big difference between thinking that someone is narcissistic and they post selfies all the time because they're suffering from some element of narcissism and actual addiction. And so when you have what's cited in this study was a bunch of young women who are constantly taking selfies of each other, you have to understand that these devices are super addictive. And I don't necessarily think, and it hasn't been proven, that it comes from a place of necessarily from a narcissistic place.
Really? So
Yeah.
if you find your own face the most interesting image in the world, that's not self-involvement? Because it seems like it to me.
I know, but actually think about it, Tucker. Wouldn't you think that if that's how you're spending your time and it's impairing your daily function, that it's actually coming from a place of really maybe perhaps low self-esteem? And so we're flooded all the time. These devices, you have to understand, Instagram and Facebook, all these social media platforms are built to be really addictive. And you can't talk to any marketing or PR agency that doesn't say, if you're trying to build a brand or a business, that you shouldn't post pictures of yourself. So that's the message that we're sending constantly. You also have to realize that the greatest population on Instagram, for example, are young women between the ages of 18 and 25. And what they look at the most is makeup and fashion. We're attracted to people's faces. That's a big difference. That's kind of a little bit of a different conversation than necessarily talking about young women or people who are super addicted to taking selfies. Unfortunately, selfies make money. If you look at Instagram at all, you'll see that there's tons of people making a lot of money by posting videos of themselves, for example, putting on makeup or doing you know, different kinds of exercises and showing people how to do that.
Can I ask you a quick question?
Yeah.
So the feminist line on this, which is dumb and wrong as usual, but dumber and wronger in this than in most, says men are the cause of women's low self-esteem, young women especially. But it sounds like these tech companies are really adding to the sum total of unhappiness for young women, and no one ever calls them out on that. Why is that?
Well, the first part of your comment I'm not necessarily sure I agree with, because I don't think all feminists believe that it's just men who are causing women to have low self-esteem.
The ones who come on TV say that.
Okay, well, I'm a feminist and I don't say that. But here's the thing. It's really important to recognize that these devices, and I agree with you that Facebook and Instagram need to have sort of a bigger ethical responsibility to create platforms that don't necessarily push people always having to post their face on the platforms and be super addictive. I agree.
Right, and those images are owned by the company in the end. Now, thank you. It's an interesting conversation.
Thank you. Thanks, Tucker.
Dan Bongino up next for more on the amazing development in the Mueller investigation. Mueller himself dressed down by a federal judge. Details ahead. Judge T.S. Ellis's remarkable attack on the Mueller investigation this morning are the latest twist in a year-long saga. At least one judge does not think the Mueller team should have unlimited authority to serve as a fourth branch of government. Dan Bongino is a former Secret Service agent and an NRA TV spokesman who joins us tonight from Dallas, Texas. What did you make of these remarks, Dan?
You know, I applaud this judge, Tucker. Let's just be candid about this. Right now, the most powerful person in America, Tucker, is Bob Mueller. He seems to have evaded the Constitution, any oversight. He's doing what Bob Mueller wants to do, and it appears at this point that Bob Mueller is doing something frightening, Tucker. He's investigating Donald Trump. He's not investigating a crime, and the judge was very clear. Hey, man, to quote the Wendy's commercial, where's the beef on this? Do you have anything, or are you investigating people simply to go after Donald Trump? Tucker, one quick story on this. I was a federal agent. I worked for the federal government, and I was a police officer. I hope the audience understands the incredible power the federal government has to ruin your life, to seize your assets, to take your freedom, to take your life. You do not investigate people. You investigate crimes and you find people. You don't investigate people and then go find crimes. That's exactly what's happening, and I think this judge saw it, and I applaud him for taking a stand.
Isn't the role of the press to kind of fact-check things like this, to act as a backstop against the abuse of power, you know, rogue investigations? Reporters are supposed to be interested in that and pushing back against that. Why aren't they?
Because, Tucker, the press are accomplices in this. Yeah, I mean, yes, I get it. With a free and fair press, you would expect they would do basic things like journalism and say something, Tucker, like, hey, is there actually a predicate crime that we're investigating here? Like, what was the actual crime? Now, listen, I don't believe the collusion story at all. But the fact is, Tucker, even if there was collusion isn't even a crime. And there was none of that. This is an embarrassment. The journalism has completely failed us. This is their most embarrassing moment in a series of embarrassing moments over the last few decades.
Well, you would think someone in the press would say, look, I don't like Trump, I get it, or I disagree with his policies, fine. But what would happen if this happened to me? I mean, any American, if this can happen to, I don't know, Carter Page or Roger Stone, I mean, why couldn't it happen to you? Why shouldn't we be worried about this?
Tucker, I've heard you bring this up before, and I hope they'll listen. I get it that we're in some respects we're preaching to the choir to some people, but I know we have liberal viewers who watch this channel here. What happens when you're president? Someone walks in and says, I want to investigate President John Smith. For what? I don't know. For something. We'll find something. Can you imagine walking into a police station and saying, I want to investigate my neighbor? What did your neighbor do? Oh, nothing, but don't worry. We'll find something later. That's not how it works.
He looks shady. Go after him. Dan Bongino, thank you. Good to see you.
You got it, Tucker.
Well, a RoboCop is coming to one major American airport. Unfortunately, it's not nearly as cool as the movie version, but we've got details for you anyway. Stay tuned.